what is financial crime and what is financial crime law? There are a lot of different ways to approach this concept and define it. And I think at a very fundamental level, all of us understand intuitively that crimes are committed for different reasons and in different manners. And one of the old traditional distinctions that you might still come across in criminological literature or indeed in popular culture writ large is this fundamental distinction between crimes of profit and crimes of passion, something that is calculated to enrich you versus something that is more spontaneous, something that is a bit more visceral, potentially more violent. And here you have two paradigmatic examples of that on the screen. On the left-hand side, you've got Bernard Madoff, known as Bernie Madoff, a prominent Wall Street financier who was a figure of extraordinary profile and a man of distinction on Wall Street for decades before his house of cards came crashing down and is now the subject of, among many other things, a well-known Netflix documentary. And on the right-hand side, you've got a fresco from, I think, the 17th century in Italy that depicts a jealous lover. So crimes of profit versus crime of passion. But this does not really encapsulate the concept of financial crime. As I'm going to show, financial crime, the way that we tend to understand this now in the context of policymaking and law enforcement, is somewhat more narrow than that. Not all crimes of profit are what we would describe as financial crime. Something that is a bit closer to the idea of financial crime that I'm going to talk about today is the notion of white-collar crime that was framed and first introduced in 1940 by the man whom you see on the right-hand side here, Edwin Sutherland, at the time the president, I think, of the American Sociological Association. And in his address to that distinguished body of scholars, in 1940, he lamented the focus of academic research on crime that concerns the lower classes of the society, or at least people who are poor, uneducated, and often come into contact with the criminal justice system. And he instead invited the scholarly community to look at white-collar crime. And this is how he explained it. White-collar criminality in business is expressed most frequently in the form of misrepresentation in financial statements of corporations, manipulation in the stock exchange, commercial bribery, and so on and so forth. And then he said, these are what Al Capone called the legitimate rackets. And Sutherland's definition of white-collar crime was crime that is perpetrated by people in a position of respectability in the context of their work activities. But even that is not quite what I want to talk about today. That is still a pretty broad category that encompasses a wide array of different crimes, and it's a very unwieldy concept to operate with. So financial crime that I want to talk about today is really more focused around the idea of using the proceeds of crime. I'm going to be talking today about money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, and economic sanctions. And I'm going to say a couple more words about each of those types of crime in just a moment. But first of all, it's important to note that financial crime, in the sense that I'm talking about it, is not limited to white-collar criminals. It's not limited to people of respectability, to people who work in office jobs. Financial crime basically refers to how criminals use their money. And it can involve the proceeds of violent criminal activities, for example, drug trafficking. Here is a striking example of this. On your slides, you see a man who is known as one of the most successful drug traffickers of our time, Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, the leader of the Mexican Sinaloa drug cartel, currently serving a prison sentence in a supermax prison facility in the United States. Probably not a person who would strike you as the poster child of financial crime, someone who's more violent, more grisly. But nonetheless, because he was running a sophisticated and successful criminal empire, of necessity, he was involved in financial crime, and that's to say laundering the proceeds of his activities, moving them around the world and investing them into various enterprises. And here on your screen, you see a fragment from a criminal indictment that was published by the United States upon his capture. I've highlighted the final statement in this paragraph, which says, Guzman Loera then used various methods to launder billions of dollars of drug proceeds, including bulk cash smuggling from the United States to Mexico, US-based insurance companies, reloadable debit cards, and numerous shell companies, including a juice company and a fish flour company. In other words, he was operating both an illicit business and a legal side to his business empire in order to launder money. And this is the kind of financial crime that I want to talk about today. It intersects also with the world of large legitimate corporations, as we see from a deferred prosecution agreement that was struck by the US Department of Justice and HSBC, a major global bank that was found to have been laundering the proceeds of various crimes, including drug operations related to Mexican drug cartels. So with this rather long introduction, what are the areas of financial crime that the course covers and why are we interested in them? The first concept that I have already referred to a couple of times is money laundering. Money laundering is really an umbrella term in that it refers to using the proceeds of crime. And that means that money laundering can be a central concept in various areas of criminal justice. If you're interested in clamping down on drug trafficking, you need to understand how criminals use the proceeds of drug trafficking. If your primary area of interest is large-scale corruption, once again, you have the same question of how people invest and move around the world, the wealth that they obtain through grand corruption. The same goes for cybercrime, arms trafficking, human trafficking, any form of serious and organized crime. So money laundering is this cross-cutting concept that is central to various areas of criminal justice. And when we talk about financial crime, most of the time this is what we're interested in. How do criminals invest and move and spend the proceeds of their crime? Countries around the world, including Australia, have got well-developed regulatory and law enforcement regimes that are aimed at going after money laundering. Those regimes, generally speaking, consist of three parts. The first part is the legislation that imposes regulatory obligations on a range of businesses that mandate reporting to the government of suspicious activities. If you open a bank account and you engage in activity that your bank thinks is suspicious, they are obliged to report that to law enforcement agencies. In Australia, that reporting is channeled through a government agency called AUSTRAC, the Australian Transactions Reporting and Analysis Centre. The second component of the overall anti-money laundering response is the legislation that enables criminal prosecutions for money laundering. If someone came to me with a suitcase full of cash and said that it comes from drug trafficking and asked me for advice on how to invest that, and I became involved in a money laundering scheme, I would be committing a criminal offense. And finally, the third component of the response is the laws that facilitate the confiscation of the proceeds of crime. Anecdotally, a number of criminals around the world are perfectly happy to go to prison because that's an occupational hazard. If anything, it's continuous professional development. You go to prison and you exchange know-how with others and you become a better criminal. But the proceeds of your crime is the point of it all. This is your security, this is your financial security, this is the future of your children. You don't want the proceeds of your crime to be taken away from you. And therefore, the third pillar of the government response is trying to take away the proceeds of crime. So this is the kind of financial crime we're interested in. Not just the fraud, not insider dealing, not any particular crime, but this general question of what happens to the proceeds of any sort of crime, what happens at the stage of money laundering? How can you take away the proceeds of criminal activity? How can you prosecute people for engaging in money laundering? And how can you impose effective regulatory obligations on businesses? On the right-hand side here, you see an example of a recent law enforcement operation here in Australia from a couple of months ago when the AFP seized $150 million worth of property, including mansions and luxury cars, in relation to an investigation into alleged organized crime activities relating to a group in China with tentacles across different countries around the world, including Australia. The obverse of money laundering is terrorist financing, and this is the other side of the coin, another major form of financial crime. As we've just discussed, money laundering involves proceeds of crime being used, generally speaking, to sustain someone's lavish lifestyle, to buy houses and cars and yachts and whatever a successful criminal might desire. Terrorist financing is the opposite of that, in that you don't have necessarily dirty money to begin with, but you direct money or other resources towards a dirty purpose, towards a terrorist act. On the left-hand side here, you see Osama bin Laden, the alleged financier and mastermind behind, among other things, the 9/11 attacks in the United States. This is the archetypal terrorist financier. Financing terrorism is, understandably and unsurprisingly, a criminal offense in almost every country in the world. And the funds that one uses to finance terrorism can be legally or illegally obtained. Those can be the proceeds of crime. For example, Hezbollah, a major terrorist organization based in Lebanon, has been accused of running drug trafficking and cigarette smuggling operations around the world. But equally, a number of terrorist attacks are financed through wholly legitimate sources of income, for example, salaries, student loans, or unemployment benefits. One added complication that makes the area of terrorist financing, or I should say counter-terrorist financing, particularly challenging is the fact that for a number of terrorist attacks in recent history, very small amounts of money have been sufficient. If, for example, one wanted to build a primitive improvised explosive device or ram a car into a crowd of people or run around stabbing people with a knife, realistically, the amounts of money involved are tiny. And that raises the important question of what is the role of counter-terrorist financing efforts in the overall fight against terrorism. And the best answer to that seems to be that we cannot possibly prevent terrorist financing just because terrorist attacks are often so cheap. But you will remember I mentioned the three components of government's responses to money laundering. One component of that response is regulatory obligations on various businesses that report suspicious activities. Similar to that, in the context of counter-terrorist financing, the obligations that regulated businesses face, for example, banks, are a useful source of financial intelligence. So we might not be able to prevent every terrorist attack. We might not be able to prevent all instances of terrorist financing, but the fact that banks and other businesses report suspicious activities makes it easier to collect information and intelligence on people who might be involved in either money laundering or terrorist financing. And that is a key area of overlap between anti-money laundering, often known as AML, and counter-terrorist financing, often known as CTF. It's the fact that both of those rely on that plethora of regulatory obligations where different businesses report suspicious activities. A somewhat similar concept in that it also refers to the use of money to finance a deeply undesirable activity is proliferation financing. And that is the financing of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. There is an international regime in place in order to prevent countries that don't have nuclear weapons already from obtaining those nuclear weapons. And in connection with the countries that are most active in seeking nuclear weapons, that's to say North Korea and Iran, but especially North Korea, there are, or have been at various moments in the past, UN-imposed sanctions in place that are supposed to make it more difficult for those countries to acquire nuclear weapons. Now those sanctions are only in place in relation to North Korea. So North Korea and, in some countries, Iran, are the primary states of concern when it comes to proliferation financing. And this is another area where you come across AML, CTF-like responses, where you try to track the flow of funds to make sure that it's not directed towards a malign purpose. And finally, the fourth area that I mentioned at the outset that is also conceivably covered by this broad umbrella of financial crime and something that has really acquired extraordinary prominence over the past couple of years, especially now with the Russia-related sanctions, is economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are a very broad term, and it denotes a huge range of measures that, in some cases, the United Nations Security Council imposes, for example, against suspected terrorist financiers. There are a number of sanctions regimes operated by the UN that basically say A, B, and C are suspected of terrorist financing. All states are obliged to freeze the assets of those people and prevent them from traveling internationally. And those decisions are binding on all UN member states because they're imposed by the UN Security Council. But that does not exhaust the field of economic sanctions. There are also multiple sanctions regimes that are imposed by states individually of their own initiative, and they relate to a wide array of perceived misconduct. Sometimes it's big picture international developments, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Sometimes it is human rights abuse in a particular country, and sanctions would be imposed against people suspected of involvement in that abuse. Now we're also seeing sanctions that are even more niche in that they're imposed in response to, for example, cyber attacks that have been perpetrated against a particular country. The United States, the European Union, and Australia are all examples of countries that have got a legal framework in place in order to impose sanctions by reference to cybercriminal activities. Those sanctions raise a wide array of different legal issues, ranging from sovereign immunity when it comes to attempts to freeze the assets of another state, so they have hardcore international law issues, to human rights problems and constitutional issues when, in the absence of a criminal punishment, a state freezes the assets of someone because they think they've engaged in a sanctionable activity. What is the connection here to money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing? Well, once again here, we're talking about attempts by states to track the flows of finance, especially across international borders, identify someone's assets, in this case, assets that derive or are connected to sanctionable activity. And once again, we're talking about the attempts of banks, among other businesses, but primarily banks, to freeze the assets of people suspected of being sanctioned or involved in sanctions evasion. So the areas that I had just outlined, money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, and economic sanctions, all broadly speaking, involve the flow of, shall we say, tainted money through the domestic and international financial systems. In some cases, that is money that derives from criminal activity. In other cases, this is money that is destined to support terrorist financing or the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And in the case of economic sanctions, it is money that is owned or is being provided for the benefit of sanctioned people and companies. What is another thing that all those crimes have in common? Well, an essential component of the global response is the development of international standards against financial crime. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that when you go to a bank and open your bank account, you're asked questions about who you are and what you do. Those answers that you provide need to be credible. You can't just say, I've inherited $10 million from my beloved aunt and not provide any details in response to that. You can't say that your name is, Prince Charles or, Little Mermaid and expect no further questions to be asked. You need to provide documents. If you engage in activity that is suspicious, so for example, you receive $1 million in a day, and then that same day you pass that same amount to someone else, and you keep doing that day after day, you're going to be reported to the government. Now, all those requirements and procedures seem common sense, but they were not there until the very late 80s. Money laundering was not a thing until 1986, when the first laws against money laundering were adopted in the United States and the United Kingdom. And internationally, there was no regulation of anti-money laundering until 1989. And in 1989, an organization called the Financial Action Task Force first convened to develop what is known as 40 recommendations. And this is the set of international standards against anti-money laundering. Then it was expanded to counter-terrorist financing after 9/11. In 2012, it was further expanded to proliferation financing as well. And these are the global standards that set out the requirements for countries in terms of criminalizing all those crimes we talked about, except some of the forms of economic sanctions, but let's leave that to one side. So countries are obliged to criminalize money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And these standards also set out the requirements that attach to banks, insurance companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, lawyers, real estate agents, high-value dealers, so diamond traders, for example, and a couple of other categories of businesses. That organization is based in this wonderful building that you see on the slide. These are the headquarters of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, headquartered in Paris. The OECD, as many of you know, is the club of economically developed countries from around the world, including Australia. And the Financial Action Task Force is technically not even an international organization. It doesn't have a founding treaty. It doesn't have a statute. It doesn't have all those accoutrements of a proper international organization. So it's headquartered there in the OECD building, basically in their basement. The employees of the Financial Action Task Force are also employees of the OECD, but even though it doesn't have that formal legal standing as an international organization, the recommendations prepared by the FATF are key to shaping the international and domestic response against financial crime. So this is the key organization that the course that I teach focuses on, but also everyone who works in the area of financial crime compliance is looking to for the latest standards, the latest guidance on the topical issues that arise. And as I'm going to mention in just a moment, the FATF plays a vitally important role of reviewing the compliance of various countries with its recommendations. So it marks the homeworks of countries around the world and issues reports that rate countries in terms of how well or how badly they're doing in tackling financial crime. So that is the introduction that I wanted to provide to the world of financial crime and some of the key forms of financial crime. What I would like to do now is to quickly highlight some of the key issues that arise in this area. This is a very short selection of just some of the key issues, so I don't lay claim to being particularly comprehensive, but I hope that will connect to some of the things that you see in the news, in newspapers, on your TV screens, and in popular culture more generally. A lot of the challenges that we're all well aware of, in fact, have something to do with financial crime. One of those challenges is how does one deal with non-compliant states? And this is something that we're all familiar with. All of us basically grow up hearing the words tax havens or offshore jurisdictions or something similar. But what exactly are those states? What does it mean to be an offshore jurisdiction? What does it mean to be a tax haven? Well, one part of the answer has to do with international taxation. And this is not something that I'm going to address here. This has to do with tax rules that countries set up in order to attract businesses from all around the world. If I set my tax rate at 0% for corporate income tax, I'm probably going to be a more attractive place for doing business, other things being equal, than a country that sets that rate at a higher level. But that's one thing, one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is secrecy, and that has direct repercussions for all the areas of financial crime that I've just mentioned. If you have a country that does enable you to go there with a suitcase full of cash and say that you're the little mermaid and you've inherited this wealth from a distant family member of yours, and you really don't want anyone to know that you have that money placed in a bank account with that particular country, then we have an obvious financial crime problem there. And there are countries that are tempted to operate in that way. Historically, there have been countries that have made a policy decision that they might compromise on some of their anti-financial crime standards for the sake of attracting more business. So how do we deal with that internationally? What can Australia do if a country in another part of the world, far away, suddenly sets up shop as a place for people from all around the world to bring their dirty money, invested, no questions asked, set up companies, set up bank accounts, and ensure complete anonymity for criminal transactions? Well, the primary response to that is at the international level, and it is operated by the organization that I've mentioned, the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. The FATF has got two lists of countries that are on its, as it were, naughty list, so countries that are not complying with the FATF recommendations. There are two stages to that list. The worst thing that can happen to you as a country, financial crime-wise, is to be placed on the FATF blacklist. That is the sort of list of financial death, where other countries around the world and businesses from other countries around the world will be particularly wary of engaging with you. This does not mean that all of your commerce with the rest of the world will grind to a halt, but quite a lot of it. So currently there are three countries on the FATF blacklist: Iran, North Korea, and Myanmar. There's a slight distinction there. There are, in effect, two different forms of blacklist, but I'm not going to go into that now for the sake of time, and it doesn't really matter all that much. The second category of the FATF list is what is known as graylisting. As the term suggests, it's quite bad to be on a grey list, but it's not as bad as being on the blacklist. Grey-listed countries have significant financial crime weaknesses, but they are not beyond the pale. They're not resistant to working with the FATF. So these are countries that have problems, but they have promised to work with the FATF to address them. So not a great place to be. There's still going to be quite a lot of focus on those countries on the grey list, but as I said, it's one step below the grey list. So what are the countries on the current grey list? There's quite a lot of them, and you see the list here on your screen. Of course, the inevitable concern with any such grey listing initiative is that the FATF is an organization that is basically a grouping of states. And when you have a grouping of states singling out some countries for failing to do something, there's always a concern about potential political influences on that process. So is there going to be a temptation to pick on small countries, to pick on relatively, insignificant is not the right word, but countries that don't have the political clout of some of the major powers? How credible, how principled is the grey listing process? This is a concern that has been aired for quite a long time, and the FATF has been receptive to it to some extent, and there is a methodology that explains how countries end up on the grey list. And one of the recent developments is ever more countries that are clearly not small and not powerless ending up on the grey list. So in the table on your screens, the countries that are highlighted in yellow are the FATF members themselves. And I should have mentioned here perhaps that the FATF has around, I think, 38 members. So it's not all countries in the world. It's a bunch of important countries, economically developed countries or economically significant countries, and a couple of regional organizations such as the EU and to the Gulf Cooperation Council. So a lot of countries around the world have to comply with the FATF rules, but are not really members of the organization. And for a long time, there was a concern that when the FATF creates its list of countries that behave badly, they pick on the non-members. So this has now changed somewhat with the inclusion of South Africa and Turkey on the grey list, both members. And the country that you see highlighted in the blue font, Nigeria, is a member of the G20. Once again, an economically powerful, significant country, not one of those tiny islands that often say that they're unfairly maligned by the FATF and other international efforts like that. So the FATF blacklist and greylist is really the major driving force behind clamping down on so-called tax havens and offshore jurisdictions. There are still a number of issues in relation to how all that works, but I think I'll leave that to one side for the purposes of today's discussion. So that was the first big issue. What is the international landscape like? How do you go after countries that don't behave? The second big issue that has been playing out in Australia is what industries should be required to report suspicious activities. And if you take a step back, it might actually seem quite radical that you go to a bank or an insurance company and they tell the government about your activities. And if they think that something is suspicious, they're going to report you. The FATF recommendations are actually quite wide-ranging. And as I mentioned, there's a whole range of businesses that are subject to them. In Australia, that hasn't been the case, especially in the non-financial sector. So here you see a comparison where the FATF says that a bunch of non-financial businesses need to be subject to reporting obligations, and Australia has been dragging behind. That is set to change, and the government is currently proposing to expand its reporting framework in line with the FATF recommendations. There's been quite a lot of pushback, especially from the legal profession, and here you see on this slide a response from the Law Council of Australia, where they say that any extension of the reporting obligations to the legal profession is actually incompatible with client confidentiality and client legal privilege. So we'll see how that plays out, but it seems to me that the trajectory is towards the expansion of those obligations to all the sectors that you saw on the previous slide, including the legal profession. And interestingly, in the past couple of years, we've seen a bunch of operations by the Australian Federal Police and state police forces around Australia targeting lawyers, in particular in connection with money laundering schemes. A bunch of lawyers across the country have been either arrested or indeed in some cases jailed on money laundering charges. So clearly there's something there, and the expansion of the reporting regime to that profession is not entirely baseless. And then finally, the third big question is, what are the unintended consequences of this whole anti-financial crime regime? When we enable the government to prosecute people for money laundering and terrorist financing, an inevitable question arises of who's a terrorist? What does it take to finance terrorism? When you create a reporting regime where your bank reports to the government who you are and what you do, that can be used as a tool of financial surveillance that in unscrupulous hands can be powerful, but also powerful in a problematic way. And also you can have all sorts of weird incentives for businesses. If they need to do a lot of checks in relation to who you are and what you do, in some cases, if you're not that valuable a customer, that might say, look, it's just more trouble than it's worth. Should we offer you a bank account? If you come from a particularly problematic social milieu, if for whatever reason you are thought of as a high-risk customer, there is a risk of de-risking or de-banking, and that is when you cannot get access to banking services. The FATF has awoken to some of those challenges and now runs a work stream on unintended consequences of financial crime rules that cover areas such as de-risking, which I've just mentioned, financial exclusion, which is a consequence of de-risking, where a whole sector of the population can't get access to banking services, then undue targeting of non-profit organizations. Imagine you run a non-profit organization and you go to your bank and say, I need to channel some of the funds into Syria, in an area where, for example, terrorist activities have been known to occur? How do you make sure that you get the money to the people who need it and support their humanitarian requirements without at the same time financing terrorism? In some areas of the world, that can be quite challenging. And finally, in some instances, you have governments simply using the anti-financial crime regime to go after the people they don't like. So in some places around the world, sadly, you see anti-money laundering laws being used against journalists who report on the abuse of power. So you can see a complete subversion of the anti-financial crime rules, where they target those who uncover financial wrongdoing rather than those who are engaged in it. So this is the whole area of unintended consequences of financial crime rules. So I'm going to stop here, and I hope that that was useful as a sort of whistle-stop tour of this area.